My wife's family. Humiliated me at dinner. Now they're the ones who lost everything. James had always been a man who believed in hard work. He spent over a decade mastering his craft, building homes from the ground up, pouring his sweat into every beam, every nail, every detail. He wasn't rich, but he was proud. Proud of the home he and his wife Elena had built together. A modest but warm 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. It was supposed to be their sanctuary. Then, everything changed. The call came on a dull Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the world felt eerily still. James picked up his phone, expecting another work order. Instead, his boss's voice, distant and clipped, told him the company was downsizing. That his job, the one he had given everything to, was no longer his. The words felt like a sledgehammer to the chest. He sat there in the parking lot for what felt like hours, gripping the steering wheel of his beat-up Ford, his calloused fingers pressing into the leather. He thought about the mortgage payment due next week, the groceries that needed to be bought, the way Elena had kissed him goodbye that morning, still half asleep, whispering, "Drive safe, babe." He thought about all of it, and for the first time in years, fear crept into his bones. But James wasn't the type to break. By the time he pulled into the driveway, he had already planned his next move. He wasn't going to sit around feeling sorry for himself. He had savings, unemployment benefits, and, most importantly, a plan. For years, he had dreamed of starting his own renovation business. Tired of watching corner-cutting contractors rake in cash while honest workers like him barely got by. Maybe this was the push he needed. At first, Elena was supportive. She picked up extra shifts at the hospital, assuring him that they'd get through this together. "We'll figure it out," she said, squeezing his hand, and James believed her. But as the weeks dragged on, something shifted. The way she looked at him changed. Subtle at first, then unmistakable. The small, affectionate smiles were replaced with tired, distant gazes. She started sighing when she checked the bills, tapping her fingers impatiently when he talked about his business ideas. And then there were the whispers, late-night phone calls in hushed tones, messages she quickly swiped away when he walked into the room. James ignored the gnawing feeling in his gut. He told himself it was just stress, that things would get better. He spent his days submitting job applications, sketching business plans, making calls. He had skills, connections, people who respected him. It was only a matter of time, but time was running out. Then, one evening, as they sat at the dinner table, in thick silence, Elena finally snapped. She tossed a crumpled bank statement across the table, her eyes sharp with resentment. "James, we're behind on the mortgage," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "How long are you going to keep chasing this dream while I kill myself at work?" James looked at the paper. One missed payment. He was already working to fix it. But that didn't matter, did it? Not to Elena. And in that moment, he realized the woman he had built a life with, the woman he thought was in this fight with him, had already started looking for a way out. The betrayal at the family. Dinner James had a bad feeling the moment they pulled into the driveway of Miriam's house. It was one of those newly built luxury homes, the kind that smelled of fresh paint and money. The windows gleamed under the evening sun. The perfectly manicured lawn stretched like a green carpet, and parked right in front, like a trophy, was Ethan's brand new BMW X7, still shining from the dealership. James glanced at his own truck, a reliable but battered Ford, and felt the weight of it all pressing against his chest. Elena was already checking her phone, fingers moving quickly, eyes barely acknowledging him. She had been distant the whole drive. But now, seeing her sister's house, she straightened, smoothing out invisible wrinkles in her dress. It was a small gesture, but James caught it. She cared about what they thought, Inside, the house smelled of expensive wine and slow-cooked roast. Miriam greeted them with an exaggerated smile, kissing Elena on the cheek, then giving James a once-over before stepping aside to let them in. "Glad you could make it," she said, her voice dripping with something close to pity. James forced a polite smile, nodding. He could already hear Ethan's laughter coming from the dining room, that smug, deep-chested sound that made James want to turn around and walk right back out the door. But he didn't. Because Elena wanted to be here. The dinner started fine. Small talk, polite laughs, the usual. But then the wine started flowing, and Ethan, never one to miss an opportunity, leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass like a king surveying his court. "So, James," he began, loud enough to turn heads. "Still between jobs, huh?" James clenched his jaw. Before he could answer, Elena cut in, her voice sharper than usual. "More like between fantasies," she said, setting down her fork. "He's been working on a business plan for months now." The table fell into silence. James felt the heat rise in his face, his grip tightening around his knife. He turned to her, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and with a dramatic flick of her wrist, tossed it onto the table. "Our mortgage statement," she announced, her voice shaking. "Missed payment. Almost lost the house." A murmur rippled across the table. Ethan smirked. Miriam gave Elena a sympathetic squeeze on the arm, as if she were comforting a grieving widow. James stared at the paper. The ink smudged from where Elena had clenched it too tightly. The payment had already been handled. But that didn't matter. This wasn't about money. Ethan let out a low chuckle. "Son, man, that's rough," he said, shaking his head in mock concern. "Maybe if you spent less time dreaming and more time actually working, you could afford something better than that old truck outside." Laughter. Quiet, but enough. Enough to make James feel like the walls were closing in. Then, Elena reached into her purse again and pulled out his wallet. It must have fallen in her car earlier. She tossed it onto the table, and it landed with a heavy thud. "I found this today," she said, flipping it open. $200 in cash. While I'm working doubles, he's stashing money away. James inhaled sharply, his fingers curling into fists. The money. For the business license. His dream. His future. And she threw it on the table like evidence in a trial. James stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He looked around the table. At Ethan's smug grin, Miriam's performative concern, the quiet judgment in the eyes of people who had never worked a hard day in their lives. Then he looked at Elena, really looked at her. And for the first time, he saw it. This wasn't a moment of frustration. This wasn't just stress. She had been waiting for this. Waiting to humiliate him. Waiting to prove, to them, to herself, that she was better than this. Better than him. The weight in his chest lightened. Not because it didn't hurt, but because, now, he understood. Without a word, James reached down, picked up his wallet, and slid the money back inside. He turned to Elena, his voice calm. Almost too calm. "The mortgage payment's been handled," he said. "Check your email." Then he turned and walked out, ignoring the stunned silence behind him. As he stepped outside, the cold night air hit his skin. But for the first time in months, he could breathe. James walks away, but not defeated. James drove through the night, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The cold air rushed through the open window, but he didn't care. He needed the bite of it, needed something to remind him that he was still awake, still here, still real. Because what had just happened, what his own wife had done, felt like something out of a nightmare. The humiliation still burned in his chest, the way they had all looked at him. The smirks, the judgment, the laughter barely stifled behind wine glasses. He had been stripped down, gutted, laid bare like a fool at a circus. And the worst part? Elena had led the act. His wife. His partner. The woman who had once told him she believed in him, who had whispered late at night about their future, about the life they were building together. And yet, when she had the chance, she threw him to the wolves. For what? To impress her sister? To fit into Ethan's picture-perfect world of luxury cars and overvalued real estate? James clenched his jaw and exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to focus on the road. The old, familiar route to Aaron's garage stretched before him, winding through the dimly lit streets, like a path he was always meant to take. Aaron had been his best friend since high school, a mechanic, a business owner, and one of the few people James knew who actually built something from the ground up. Unlike Ethan, who bought and sold houses he never worked on, Aaron got his hands dirty. He knew the value of real work, of honest effort. The garage was dark when James pulled in, the sign above the door flickering weakly. He killed the engine, sat there for a moment, then let out a long breath. The weight in his chest hadn't disappeared, but now it was changing, solidifying. He wasn't broken. Not yet. A light flicked on inside, and a second later, the side door creaked open. Aaron stepped out, barefoot, his shirt wrinkled from sleep. His hair was a mess, but his eyes sharpened when he saw James. "Damn," he muttered, rubbing his face. "You look like hell." James let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Feel like it too." Aaron studied him for a beat, then nodded toward the garage. "Come inside. I got beer." James followed him in, the scent of motor oil and steel filling his lungs. The garage had always been a second home to him, a place where things made sense. Machines could be fixed. Broken parts could be replaced, if only people were that simple. Aaron popped the cap off a beer and handed it over. "What happened?" James stared at the bottle for a moment before answering. "Elena." He exhaled sharply. "The whole damn family. They set me up. Publicly. He swallowed, trying to force down the bitterness in his throat. "She made me the joke of the night." Aaron leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. He didn't interrupt, just listened. James took a long sip before continuing. "They laughed at my truck, my work, my plans, like I'm some washed-up loser, like I don't belong." He shook his head. "And Elena, she let them. She led them." Aaron let out a low whistle. "Damn," James nodded, fingers tightening around the bottle. "Yeah." For a moment, silence settled between them, thick and heavy. Then Aaron smirked, tilting his head. "You remember what I told you about Ethan a few years back?" James frowned, thinking. Aaron took another sip of his beer and leaned in. "I service half the luxury cars in this town. You know how many times Ethan's fancy BMW has come into my shop?" He let the words hang in the air. "More times than I can count." James raised an eyebrow. "Transmission shot," Aaron said, smirking. "He's all about appearances. Buys houses, flips them quick, but he cuts corners, uses the cheapest labor he can find. That guy's business is a ticking time bomb." James sat up straighter, something shifting inside him. Aaron watched him closely. "You got something those assholes don't, man." He tapped the beer bottle against the table. "Integrity. Skill. You do things right. And I know for a fact there are people in this town looking for someone like you." The words hit James hard, but in the best way. Like someone had taken a match to the fire already burning inside him. He had been so caught up in the humiliation, in the betrayal, that he hadn't stopped to see the bigger picture. Ethan's empire was built on sand. And James? He was about to build something that would outlast them all. The rise begins. James hadn't turned his phone on in days. He knew what would be waiting: calls from Elena, messages from Miriam, maybe even a few passive-aggressive voicemails from Ethan, demanding to know why he had walked out like some sore loser. But James didn't care. He wasn't licking his wounds. He was sharpening his blade. For weeks, he had been working on his business plan, refining every detail. But now, it was time to move. Sitting in the back office of Aaron's garage, James cracked his knuckles and started making calls. Not to friends, not to family, but to the people who actually mattered in his world. The ones who built things with their own hands. First, he called Mason, an electrician he had worked with on job sites before. A guy who took pride in wiring homes the right way instead of the cheapest way. Then he called Luis, a contractor who had been burned by shady developers, more times than he could count. Then Victor, a plumber who always said he'd rather quit the industry than work with men like Ethan. One by one, the conversations played out the same way. James? Damn, man. Haven't heard from you in a while. I've got a proposition for you. Go on. And when James laid it out for them, his plan to start a home renovation company that actually did things right, a business built on quality and reputation instead of shortcuts and quick flips, there was hesitation at first. Then excitement. Then commitment. Because these men, they were tired. Tired of watching con artists like Ethan rake in money while honest workers barely scraped by. Tired of seeing their names attached to projects they weren't proud of. James gave them a way out. A way forward. By the end of the night, he had 3 crews ready to go, all willing to take a leap of faith with him, not just because they believed in him, but because they wanted revenge on every fraud who ever made them feel disposable. The next morning, he went to the bank. The loan officer, Mrs. Caldwell, had been working in town for over 30 years. She had seen businesses rise and fall, had watched men like Ethan come and go. She studied James as he handed over his documents. "You sure about this?" she asked, peering over her glasses. James met her gaze, steady as steel. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She exhaled through her nose, nodded, and stamped the paperwork. Loan approved. As he stepped outside, the weight on his chest lifted for the first time in months. He had the team. He had the funding. Now, all he needed were clients. That's when his phone vibrated. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "James? This is Mr. Harrison. My wife and I, well, we heard through the grapevine that you might be starting your own business." James stilled. "Ethan renovated our kitchen last year. Looks beautiful, but we just found black mold under the cabinets." Silence. "Think you could take a look?" James grinned. Oh, he could do more than that. The rise had begun. The fall of Ethan James didn't need to announce his success. Ethan's downfall did it for him. At first, it started small. A few whispers in the contractor circles. A handful of frustrated homeowners murmuring in hushed tones about shoddy work, leaks, electrical failures, and floors that started buckling just months after renovation. Then, the murmurs turned into phone calls. James's phone wouldn't stop ringing. The Harrisons were just the beginning. After fixing their kitchen, removing the mold, replacing the cut-rate plywood Ethan had passed off as high-end cabinets, and properly sealing the plumbing, word spread fast. Within a week, the Petersons called. Their bathroom renovation, one of Ethan's masterpieces, had faulty piping that was one shower away from flooding their entire second floor. Then, the Wilsons. Their deck, barely 6 months old, was already sagging, one loose board away from sending someone to the emergency room. And as James fixed them, one by one, something incredible happened. People started talking, not just homeowners, but contractors, suppliers, inspectors, The very people Ethan had spent years stepping on. And they weren't just talking. They were turning on him. James sat back and watched it all unfold. He didn't have to destroy Ethan. Ethan had done that himself. The panic begins one evening. James was finishing up work on the Petersons' home when his phone buzzed. A name flashed across the screen. Miriam. He ignored it. Another call. Then another. Then a text. Ethan needs to talk to you, please. James smirked. Oh, now he wants to talk. He took his time driving back to Aaron's garage, enjoying the way his old truck, his paid-off truck, rumbled against the pavement. He finally checked his voicemail, expecting anger, maybe even threats. But what he heard made him laugh. Ethan wasn't angry. He was begging. James, listen, man, I think we got off on the wrong foot. Look, there's a lot of misunderstandings going around right now. People are canceling jobs, and, we're both in the same industry, right? No need to step on each other's toes. Maybe we could, I don't know, work something out. You got a good thing going. I can see that. Maybe there's a partnership here? Call me back. James tossed his phone onto the seat beside him. Ethan thought this was about competition. He didn't realize this was personal. The final blow. 2 days later, a foreclosure sign went up in front of Ethan's house. James drove by slowly, taking in the sight. His fancy BMW. Gone. Probably repossessed. The man who once smirked at his old Ford was drowning in debt. His business collapsing under the weight of his own lies. James didn't call him back. There was nothing left to say. Ethan had laughed at him. Now the whole town was laughing at Ethan. The ultimate showdown. James had no intention of seeing Ethan ever again. As far as he was concerned, the man was finished. His business crumbling. His house on the verge of foreclosure. And his reputation dragged through the mud he built his empire on. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It happened at O'Reilly's Bar and Grill, a casual place where contractors, mechanics, and blue-collar workers gathered after long shifts. James had stopped by to grab a beer with Aaron, celebrating another successful job completion. When the air in the room changed, the low hum of conversation shifted, heads turning toward the entrance. Then, a voice cut through the noise. You, son of a... James looked up, already knowing who it was before his eyes even landed on him. Ethan. He looked rough. His usual crisp button-up was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and there was a wild, desperate look in his eyes. A man who had lost everything and was searching for someone to blame. James took a slow sip of his beer and leaned back. Calm, unbothered. Inside voice. Ethan. He said, smirking. This is a respectable establishment. Ethan stormed toward him, fists clenched at his sides. You think this is funny? He growled. James shrugged. A little. The bar had gone silent now. All eyes locked on them. Contractors, old clients and business owners. People who once shook Ethan's hand, now waiting to see him unravel. You destroyed my business. Ethan spat. You ran your mouth, took my clients, turned everyone against me. James raised an eyebrow. I ran my mouth. No, Ethan, your work did that. I just fixed what you ruined. Ethan slammed his fist onto the table. You don't get it. I was on top. I built something great. And now it's all gone because of you. James exhaled, setting his beer down. Then he stood up slowly, deliberately, so Ethan had to look up at him. You built something all right, James said, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. You built a house of lies, with cheap materials and stolen money. You cut corners, you scammed people, and you thought no one would notice. James leaned in just a little. Well, they noticed. Ethan's face flushed red, but there was nothing left to say. Because James was right, a chair scraped from the side. And Mr. Harrison, one of Ethan's former clients, stood up, arms crossed. "Ethan," he said, shaking his head, "you did this to yourself." Then the Petersons. Then the Wilsons. One by one, the people Ethan had wronged turned their backs on him. And that was the final blow. Ethan swallowed hard, his hands trembling. He looked at James one last time, and in that moment, James saw it. Not anger, not hate, but fear. Then, without another word, Ethan turned and walked out. This time, he was the one leaving in shame, sweet revenge and moving forward. The foreclosure sign was still up in front of Ethan's once pristine home, a glaring symbol of everything he had lost. James passed by it on his way to a client's house, and for the first time in a long time, he felt nothing. No anger, no bitterness, just a quiet satisfaction that justice had taken care of itself. Ethan had mocked him, underestimated him. Now, the man who once ridiculed James's old truck was homeless, drowning in debt, and completely alone. James pulled into his own driveway, his home, paid for, secure. No foreclosure signs, no financial ruin looming over his head. His business was thriving. Clients trusted him, respected him. His name meant something in this town now. But even with Ethan out of the picture, there was still unfinished business. His phone buzzed. Another voicemail from Elena. The messages had started weeks ago. At first, short and cold. Then longer, more desperate. "I miss you, James. I didn't mean for things to go this far. I was just scared. Please, let's talk." He never responded. But that didn't stop her from trying. The final meeting. That evening, James sat in the corner booth of a quiet diner, nursing a coffee as Elena walked in. She looked different, thinner, tired, as if the weight of her choices had finally crashed down on her. She sat across from him, her hands twisting the napkin in her lap. "You actually came," she said, voice small. James leaned back, studying her. "What do you want, Elena?" She flinched, as if she had expected a softer tone. I just want to talk. She swallowed, glancing at the table before meeting his eyes. "I made a mistake. A huge mistake." James said nothing. She inhaled shakily. "I should have stood by you. I should have trusted you. I let them turn me against you. And I was wrong." Her voice cracked. "You were building something real. And I tore you down instead of helping you." James exhaled slowly, fingers tapping against his coffee cup. "Yeah," he said finally. "You did." Her eyes glistened. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were overnight. I want a second chance." She reached across the table as if to take his hand. He didn't move. For a long moment, James just stared at her. Once upon a time, he might have fallen for this, might have wanted to believe her, but not anymore. "You made your choice, Elena." His voice was calm, steady, unforgiving. She flinched. "James, you chose them." He gestured vaguely. "You chose their money, their judgment, their world. You humiliated me to impress them." Her eyes filled with panic. "I didn't mean." "You did." Silence. James picked up his coffee, took one last sip, and stood. He pulled a few bills from his wallet and placed them on the table. For the coffee. Then he turned, walked out of the diner, and didn't look back. Elena had made her decision months ago. Now, so had he.